Now, the rest of the story. It was a warm summer evening. The beautiful ship, all white and gold, set sail for the open sea. The first star had not yet shone when somebody on deck looked back and saw the rowboats, dozens of rowboats, swarming between the ship and the shore, headed their way. It was a tradition of sorts that cadets from the naval college nearby would row out to bid departing vessels bon voyage, and this particular evening was no exception. As the rowboats drew nearer, passengers aboard the ship gathered at the rail to watch. Then one by one the tiny craft turned back to port, and the passengers dispersed. They had failed to realize that one rowboat remained, a rowboat with a solitary young cadet at the oars. Athletic, flaxen-haired, his piercing blue eyes searched the ship's deck until they beheld a young girl. There she was, in the gently descending twilight, peering at him from the rail through binoculars as he bobbed and pitched in the ship's wake. They'd met only that day. The young cadet had been summoned from morning chapel to look after two sisters, ages 9 and 13, while their parents were visiting the school. They were staying at the Admiral's house, where the cadet found the girls amusing themselves with a train set, which had been elaborately laid out on the floor of the nursery. Perhaps they were hungry, he had suggested. The girls nodded, and the cadet prepared a tray of ginger biscuits and lemonade. Afterward, they played croquet in the garden, and then went down to the tennis court, where the cadet showed the girls how to jump over the net. And all the while, the older sister, the 13-year-old, never took her eyes off that handsome young man. Now it was evening. There they were, gazing intently at each other across the water, for some reason neither completely understood. He looked so much like a young Viking, the girl thought, with those strong, sharp features and that fair hair and those ice-blue eyes. And she felt very much at that moment, for the first time in her young life, like a princess. A princess, perhaps abducted by infamous pirates and prepared for her rescue by the shining young man whose silhouette stood etched against the darkening day. That dream was shattered by the captain's stern voice. "You there, young man, turn back now, or we shall have to send you back." Indeed, the shoreline was growing distant. The girl brought the binoculars down slowly from her face, and then impetuously, wildly, she began to wave. The Viking smiled and waved back, and rowed for home. Sometimes on this barren earth, where fairy tales wither and die, a few flourish, if only for magical moments. And so it happened one day, in July of 1939, when an 18-year young cadet at the Dartmouth Royal Naval College was called upon to babysit two young sisters. You see, he began writing letters to the elder sister thereafter. For the fair-haired Viking who rowed out to the departing royal yacht that evening was in fact a young prince, and the girl, for the first time, really felt like a princess. Today the world nods in reverence to both of them, Prince Philip and his and England's Queen Elizabeth. Only now you know the rest of the story.
And now the rest of the story. Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth II were married for over 73 years, the longest of any British monarch in history. But if you search the internet for when Prince Philip and Princess Elizabeth first met, you'll get varying responses. Now, when I say first met, what does that actually mean? May sound simple, but in this case, it's not so easy. Let's take a look. In this episode, Mr. Harvey said they, Prince Philip and Princess Elizabeth, had met only that day. According to this broadcast, Prince Philip, then an 18-year-old cadet at Dartmouth Royal Naval College, was asked to look after two princesses aged 9 and 13. Now, of course, those princesses were Princess Margaret, Princess Elizabeth. Mr. Harvey said this meeting was in July of 1939, which works out mathematically based on their ages. According to newspaper accounts, Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret accompanied the King and Queen on a 2-day visit to the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth from July the 21st to the 23rd, 1939. Over 400 vessels, more than 100 of which were from the Royal Naval College, surrounded the royal yacht Victoria and Albert when it left Dartmouth College. Prince Philip was probably in one of those boats, as Mr. Harvey explained. According to the royal family's official website, Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip first met in November 1934, 5 years earlier, when Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark married Prince George, Duke of Kent, at Westminster Abbey. Princess Elizabeth was 8 years old, Prince Philip 13. Take a look at this photo. In the center of the photo is Prince Albert, the future King George VI, and his wife, Elizabeth. Further down the left is 8-year-old Princess Elizabeth. 13-year-old Prince Philip is standing in the back. Now, at that time, there was no reason to suspect that Princess Elizabeth would become Queen of England. Let me explain. In 1934, Princess Elizabeth's grandfather, George V, was King of England. Princess Elizabeth affectionately called him Grandfather England. That's adorable. Upon his death, according to the line of succession, King George V's eldest son, Prince Edward VIII, would become king, which he did in January of 1936. He announced that he planned to marry the love of his life, Wallis Simpson. His engagement to Miss Simpson caused a constitutional crisis because Wallis Simpson was seeking her second divorce. It was considered politically and socially unacceptable for the King of England to marry a divorced woman with 2 living ex-husbands. Ultimately, in December of the same year, 1936, King Edward VIII abdicated the throne to marry Wallis Simpson. He gave it all up. Upon his abdication, the line of succession shifted to King George V's second oldest son, Prince Albert, Princess Elizabeth's father. Prince Albert took the royal title Prince George VI. Prince George VI had 2 children, Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret. That put Elizabeth next in line to the throne. Now, on a side note, if Princess Elizabeth's parents had more children, and had one of those children been a male, the line of succession would have gone to the male child, even though he would have been a younger heir. That's just the way it worked at the time. Prince Philip and Princess Elizabeth met again in 1937 at her father's coronation, though they weren't formally introduced by all accounts. They were finally properly introduced for the first time at Dartmouth Royal Naval College in July of 1939. At one point during their 2-day visit, the royal family played croquet with some of the cadets, including Prince Philip. Here's a photo of Prince Philip and Princess Elizabeth talking during that game. You can see the croquet hoop beside Princess Elizabeth's right arm. Dr. Jane Harold, a historian, said, "While the king and queen were off doing their official duties, they needed somebody to look after the 2 princesses, and who better to look after a couple of princesses than a prince?" Strictly speaking, they had met before, but those were very formal, official occasions, and Elizabeth wrote later that this was the first time she remembered meeting Philip. Prince Philip was never meant to be at the college at all. He was what was called a special entry cadet. At the time, the British Royal Naval College at Dartmouth was a public school for 13-year-old children who were not in the Navy but hoped to get a commission after graduating from that college. Prince Philip should have been at sea in HMS Shropshire, but HMS Shropshire was in refit. Their superiors didn't really know what to do with these special entry cadets, so they sent them to the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth. Now, they were 18 years old, 5 years older than the rest of the cadets. So Prince Philip wasn't even supposed to be there. I guess that's what you'd call fate. Dr. Jane Harold probably got her information from the writings of Marion Crawford. Now, Marion Crawford was one of the long-term governesses of Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret. The princesses affectionately called her Crawfie. That'll come into play later. Shortly after Princess Elizabeth married Prince Philip in 1947, Marion Crawford retired from service to the crown. Upon her retirement, she was given Nottingham Cottage on the grounds of Kensington Palace for the gratitude of past services to the crown. In 1948, Bruce and Beatrice Gould, editors of Ladies' Home Journal, contacted Buckingham Palace and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in search of articles for their magazine. Now, Buckingham Palace refused to participate, but the British government suggested they contact Marion Crawford. Queen Elizabeth, Princess Elizabeth's mother, wrote to Marion Crawford. She said, "I do feel most definitely that you should not write and sign articles about the children, as people in positions of confidence with us must be utterly oyster. If you, the moment you finished teaching Margaret, started writing about her and Lilibet, well, we should never feel confidence in anyone again." Despite numerous requests, Marion Crawford went ahead with the project anyway. She was the first royal servant to cash in on the private lives of the royals. She was ostracized by the royal family. They never spoke to her again. For many years, any former royal servant who spoke publicly for money was said to be doing a Crawfie. According to Marion Crawford's writings, due to a mumps outbreak among some of the cadets at the Royal Naval College, Elizabeth and Margaret were sent to play with children in the captain's house. Among them was a fair-haired, off-handed boy of 18 who showed off to them by jumping the tennis nets and eating several plates full of shrimps for tea, Marion wrote of Philip. Elizabeth purportedly never took her eyes off Philip. When Philip and his uncle, Lord Dicky Mountbatten, were invited to join the Windsors for dinner on the royal yacht, Elizabeth is said to have turned pink-faced in the company of the cadet. Lord Mountbatten later wrote in his diary that the meeting had been a great success. By all accounts, Lord Mountbatten had been scheming to get his favorite nephew, that's Prince Philip, together with Princess Elizabeth, even more so when she became next in line to the throne. Earlier I said the meeting was fate. Well, maybe fate needs a gentle persuasion sometimes, don't you think? Now, before I go, I want to take just a moment to thank my subscribers and thank you for watching this video. I also want to thank those of you who have joined and made contributions to this channel. If you would like to help this channel grow and improve, I'll leave a link to join or donate in the description. I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching, and now you know the rest of the story.